Welcome to CraftLit. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 23, Return of the Chicks. Well, hello, and welcome to episode 23. I still can't believe how many episodes there have been. And I'm podcasting this week on Tuesday, which I normally don't do. Normally I podcast on Thursday, but my husband's coming to town for the first time in 6 weeks. And I'm sorry, but I'm just not going to take time out of that day to podcast for you. I only have 3 full days with him, and I'm just not going to be doing much else than hanging out with him. So if anything, huge or interesting happens between Tuesday and Thursday, now you'll understand why I'm not talking about it. So I tried to pick 2 distinctly chick-themed, or at least chick-written pieces for today. And I actually couldn't do that because the women's stories, the ones actually written by women, they do go on. And it would have actually taken up the entire hour just to load 2 stories. So instead, I have one story that's kind of about a woman as the main character. And then I have another story that is written by a woman about women. And one of them, the first one by Guy de Maupassant, whose name I love to say, Guy de Maupassant. He wrote many, many stories, and I'm sure you've heard of the one that we're going to listen to today. The second one is by, if you've read the show notes on the Blogspot or the Libsyn website, the second one is written by Edna Ferber. And my introduction to Edna Ferber was actually in the movie that Jennifer Jason Leigh did about Dorothy Parker in The Vicious Circle. Edna Ferber is a character in there, and the guy who I was on a date with knew exactly who she was. As soon as she opened her mouth, he said, "Oh, it's Edna." And I thought, wow, what a horribly unattractive name. Why is someone named Edna at the round table with, Wolcott and Parker and all these other people? And later, I found out that, she was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer and a very well-known lesbian and a very well-known writer, and really quite something. The story that I will play today, well, I'll introduce it more later, but I'll just let you know, it's slow to start. And I actually tried listening to it twice before it finally caught on with me. If any of you have ever read Faulkner, like A Rose for Emily or anything like that, this is in that same vein. You get this slow build of neighborhood stuff. And I'll do more about that later. But right now, I feel horrible. I got a promo from Lyman Violet weeks ago after having badgered them to send me one. And I've been so panicked to try and get enough story into the hour that GarageBand allots me that I completely forgot to put their promo on. And because I'm living my life out of bags right now, I can't find the promo. I feel, how when you don't have your own space, you kind of feel like pieces of you keep falling off and you lose them? One of them is the promo. So Lyman Violet, if you are still listening, though, please don't hate me, and please send me the promo, and I swear I'll put it on the next episode. I just feel horrible. The other little piece of news I have is, aside from the fact that my sister's cat keeps screaming at me, I got to actually meet one of our listeners this last weekend. Kate in Tucson has a lovely daughter, Zora, and Kate and I met at a park and a little library story day group, and my 2 boys took to Zora like fish to water. It was a big hug fest between the 3 of them, and boy, was it nice to have not just an adult, but a fabulous adult who, is interested in similar things and knows how to knit and And she made the cutest little Jaywalker zebra striped socks for Zora. It was just great. So, Kate, thank you again, and I'll get back in touch with you after this weekend with my husband in town. So our first story today, which is actually the second story that I talk about on the website, the show notes, is The Diamond Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. And I picked it for a couple of reasons. For one, it kind of ties into last week's show because it is quite definitely ironic, as is our second thing. I think the best short stories, or at least the ones that I like the best, tend to have some amount of irony in them. I think it lends itself very well to the short story genre. The other thing that I really like about it is that it's really good situational irony. I tend to be drawn towards verbal irony. I think it's a lot of fun. You can probably tell by now, I have a sense of humor. So I like that kind of thing, but really well constructed situational irony is spectacular. And this is probably one of the best examples of it. De Maupassant was was born in 1850, which I don't know about you, if you've heard the story before. I was a little surprised that he was born that early. He only lived until the late 1800s, and it's really quite shocking to me because I think his texts, although they're quite clearly set back in the day, as my kids used to say, I've always felt that they were very modern. And in that sense, I guess he's kind of like Stephen Crane or even Ambrose Bierce in some ways, that his writing isn't particularly creaky. He certainly uses larger words than we have in our daily lexicon anymore, but it's not that kind of stiff, stilted, Victorian-sounding writing. It's almost like when the people do speak and they sound kind of old-fashioned, it's almost like I didn't notice. And that could be because he is part of the naturalist school, meaning that he strove to create a natural world in the descriptions that he used. The same kind of thing was happening in theater at the same time. It actually got so ridiculous that they were doing this imaginary fourth wall stuff in the theater, where the wall where the audience sat, the invisible fourth wall. Sometimes they actually would construct a wall for rehearsals and construct a drop ceiling, which made lighting the stage extraordinarily difficult. But they did this all in the name of naturalism and naturalistic acting. And this is part of that same time period, that same movement. Certainly that changes later on, but I do think that de Maupassant is one of the best examples of somebody who used both that situational irony and also very, very naturalistic writing, which creates, I think, some spectacularly believable situations and characters. Do pay attention to how carefully he builds the situational irony. At the beginning, it just sounds like a story about a young married couple, and by the end, it's just brilliantly turned on itself. And parenthetically, I just listened to myself, and I apologize for the pops both here and on the upcoming story. I have no explanation for the peas on the story, but for me, it's because I'm under a blanket again. So without any further ado, and I realize now that is something that I just say, so I'm going to stop trying to think of something better, and I'm just going to continue to say it. Without any further ado, I bring you The Diamond Necklace by Guy de Maupassant.
The Diamond Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. The girl was one of those pretty and charming young creatures who sometimes are born, as if by a slip of fate, into a family of clerks. She had no dowry, no expectations, no way of being known, understood, loved, married by any rich and distinguished man. So she let herself be married to a little clerk of the Ministry of Public Instruction. She dressed plainly because she could not dress well, but she was unhappy, as if she had really fallen from a higher station. Since with women there is neither caste nor rank, for beauty, grace, and charm take the place of family and birth. Natural ingenuity, instinct for what is elegant, a supple mind, are their sole hierarchy, and often make of women of the people the equals of the very greatest ladies. Mathilde suffered ceaselessly, feeling herself born to enjoy all delicacies and all luxuries. She was distressed at the poverty of her dwelling, at the bareness of the walls, at the shabby chairs, the ugliness of the curtains. All those things, of which another woman of her rank would not even have been conscious, tortured her and made her angry. The sight of the little Breton peasant who did her humble housework aroused in her despairing regrets and bewildering dreams. She thought of the silent antechambers hung with oriental tapestry, illumined by tall bronze candelabra, and of 2 great footmen in knee-breeches, who sleep in the big armchairs, made drowsy by the oppressive heat of the stove. She thought of long reception halls hung with ancient silk, of the dainty cabinets containing priceless curiosities, and of the little coquettish perfumed reception rooms made for chatting at 5 o'clock with intimate friends, with men famous and sought after, whom all women envy and whose attention they all desire. When she sat down to dinner, before the round table covered with a tablecloth in use 3 days, opposite her husband, who uncovered the soup tureen and declared with a delighted air, "Ah, the good soup! I don't know anything better than that." She thought of dainty dinners, of shining silverware, of tapestry peopled the walls with ancient personages and with strange birds flying in the midst of a fairy forest. And she thought of delicious dishes served on marvelous plates, and of the whispered gallantries to which you listen with a sphinx-like smile while you are eating the pink meat of a trout or the wings of a quail. She had no gowns, no jewels, nothing. And she loved nothing but that. She felt made for that. She would have liked so much to please, to be envied, to be charming, to be sought after. She had a friend, a former schoolmate at the convent, who was rich, and whom she did not like to go to see any more, because she felt so sad when she came home. But one evening her husband reached home with a triumphant air, and holding a large envelope in his hand. "There," said he, "there is something for you." She tore the paper quickly, and drew out a printed card which bore these words: "The Minister of Public Instruction and Madame Georges Ramponneau request the honor of Monsieur and Madame Loisel's company at the Palace of the Ministry on Monday evening, January 18th. Instead of being delighted, as her husband had hoped, she threw the invitation on the table crossly, muttering, "What do you wish me to do with that?" "Why, my dear, I thought you would be glad. You never go out, and this is such a fine opportunity. I had great trouble to get it. Every one wants to go. It is very select, and they are not giving many invitations to clerks. The whole official world will be there." She looked at him with an irritated glance, and said impatiently, "And what do you wish me to put on my back?" He had not thought of that. He stammered, Why, the gown you go to the theatre in. It looks very well to me." He stopped, distracted, seeing that his wife was weeping. 2 great tears ran slowly from the corners of her eyes towards the corners of her mouth. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" he answered. By a violent effort she conquered her grief, and replied in a calm voice, while she wiped her wet cheeks, "Nothing, only I have no gown, and therefore I can't go to this ball. Give your card to some colleague whose wife is better equipped than I am." He was in despair. He resumed, "Come, let us see, Mathilde. How much would it cost, a suitable gown, which you could use on other occasions, something very simple?" She reflected several seconds, making her calculations, and wondering also what sum she could ask without drawing herself an immediate refusal and a frightened exclamation from the economical clerk. Finally she replied, hesitating, I don't know exactly, but I think I could manage it with 400 francs. He grew a little pale, because he was laying aside just that amount to buy a gun, and treat himself to a little shooting next summer on the plain of Nanterre with several friends who went to shoot larks there of a Sunday. But he said, "Very well, I will give you 400 francs, and tried to have a pretty gown. The day of the ball drew near, and Madame Loisel seemed sad, uneasy, anxious. Her frock was ready, however. Her husband said to her one evening, "What is the matter? Come, you have seemed very queer these last 3 days." And she answered, "It annoys me not to have a single piece of jewelry, not a single ornament, nothing to put on. I shall look poverty-stricken. I would almost rather not go at all." "You might wear natural flowers," said her husband. "They're very stylish at this time of year. For 10 francs you could get 2 or 3 magnificent roses." She was not convinced. "No, there's nothing more humiliating than to look poor among other women who are rich." "How stupid you are!" her husband cried. "Go look up your friend, Madame Forestier, and ask her to lend you some jewels. You're intimate enough with her to do that." She uttered a cry of joy. "True! I never thought of it." The next day she went to her friend and told her of her distress. Madame Forestier went to a wardrobe with a mirror, took out a large jewel-box, brought it back, opened it, and said to Madame Loisel, "Choose, my dear." She saw first some bracelets, then a pearl necklace, then a Venetian gold cross set with precious stones, of admirable workmanship. She tried on the ornaments before the mirror, hesitated, and could not make up her mind to part with them, to give them back. She kept asking, "Haven't you any more?" "Why, yes. Look further. I don't know what you like." Suddenly she discovered, in a black satin box, a superb diamond necklace, and her heart throbbed with an immoderate desire. Her hands trembled as she took it. She fastened it round her throat, outside her high-necked waist, and was lost in ecstasy at her reflection in the mirror. Then she asked, hesitating, filled with anxious doubt, "Will you lend me this? Only this?" "Why, yes, certainly." She threw her arms around her friend's neck, kissed her passionately, then fled with her treasure. The night of the ball arrived. Madame Loisel was a great success. She was prettier than any other woman present, elegant, graceful, smiling and wild with joy. All the men looked at her, asked her name, sought to be introduced. All the attachés of the cabinet wished to waltz with her. She was remarked by the minister himself. She danced with rapture, with passion, intoxicated by pleasure, forgetting all in the triumph of her beauty, in the glory of her success, in a sort of cloud of happiness comprised of all this homage, admiration, these awakened desires, and of that sense of triumph which is so sweet to woman's heart. She left the ball about 4 o'clock in the morning. Her husband had been sleeping since midnight in a little deserted anteroom with 3 other gentlemen whose wives were enjoying the ball. He threw over her shoulders the wraps he had brought, the modest wraps of common life, the poverty of which contrasted with the elegance of the ball-dress. She felt this, and wished to escape so as not to be remarked by the other women, who were enveloping themselves in costly furs. Loisel held her back, saying, "Wait a bit. You will catch cold outside. I will call a cab." But she did not listen to him, and rapidly descended the stairs. When they reached the street, they could not find a carriage, and began to look for one, shouting after the cabmen passing at a distance. They went towards the Seine in despair, shivering with cold. At last they found on the quay one of those ancient night-cabs which, as though they were ashamed to show their shabbiness during the day, are never seen round Paris until after dark. It took them to their dwelling in the Rue des Martyrs, and sadly they mounted the steps to their flat. All was ended for her. As to him, he reflected that he must be at the ministry at 10 o'clock that morning. She removed her wraps before the glass, so as to see herself once more in all her glory. But suddenly she uttered a cry. She no longer had the necklace around her neck. "What is the matter with you?" demanded her husband, already half undressed. She turned distractedly toward him. I have lost Madame Forestier's necklace," she cried. He stood up, bewildered. "What? How? Impossible!" They looked among the folds of her skirt, of her cloak, in her pockets, everywhere, but did not find it. "You're sure you had it on you when you left the ball?" he asked. "Yes, I felt it in the vestibule of the minister's house." "But if you had lost it in the street, we should have heard it fall. It must be in the cab." "Yes, probably. Did you take his number?" "No. And didn't you notice it?" "No." They looked, thunderstruck, at each other. At last Loisel put on his clothes. "I shall go back on foot," said he, "over the whole route, to see whether I can find it." He went out. She sat waiting on a chair in her ball dress, without strength to go to bed, overwhelmed, without any fire, without a thought. Her husband returned about 7 o'clock. He had found nothing. He went to police headquarters, to newspaper offices to offer a reward. He went to the cab companies, everywhere, in fact, whither he was urged by the least spark of hope. She waited all day, in the same condition of mad fear before this terrible calamity. Loisel returned at night with a hollow, pale face. He had discovered nothing. "You must write to your friend," said he, "that you have broken the clasp of her necklace, and that you are having it mended. That will give us time to turn round." She wrote at his dictation. At the end of a week they had lost all hope. Loisel, who had aged 5 years, declared, "We must consider how to replace that ornament." The next day they took the box that had contained it and went to the jeweller whose name was found within. He consulted his books. "It was not I, madam, who sold that necklace. I must have simply furnished the case." Then they went from jeweller to jeweller, searching for a necklace like the other, trying to recall it, both sick with chagrin and grief. They found, in a shop at the Palais Royal, a string of diamonds that seemed to them exactly like the ones they had lost. It was worth 40,000 francs. They could have it for 36. So they begged the jeweller not to sell it for 3 days yet, and they made a bargain that he should buy it back for 34,000 francs, in case they should find the lost necklace before the end of February. Loisel possessed 18,000 francs, which his father had left him. He would borrow the rest. He did borrow, asking 1,000 francs of one, 500 of another, 5 louis here, 3 louis there. He gave notes, took up ruinous obligations, dealt with usurers and all the race of lenders. He compromised all the rest of his life, risked signing a note without even knowing whether he could meet it, and frightened by the trouble yet to come, by the black misery that was about to fall upon him, by the prospect of all the physical privations and moral tortures that he was to suffer, he went to get the new necklace, laying upon the jeweller's counter 36,000 francs. When Madame Loisel took back the necklace, Madame Forestier said to her with a chilly manner, "You should have returned it sooner. I might have needed it." She did not open the case, as her friend had so much feared. If she had detected the substitution, what would she have thought? What would she have said? Would she not have taken Madame Loisel for a thief? Thereafter Madame Loisel knew the horrible existence of the needy. She bore her part, however, with sudden heroism. That dreadful debt must be paid. She would pay it. They dismissed their servant. They changed their lodgings. They rented a garret under the roof. She came to know what heavy housework meant, and the odious cares of the kitchen. She washed the dishes, using her dainty fingers and rosy nails on greasy pots and pans. She washed the soiled linen, the shirts and the dishcloths, which she dried upon a line. She carried the slops down to the street every morning, and carried up the water, stopping for breath at every landing. And dressed like a woman of the people, she went to the fruiterer, the grocer, the butcher, a basket on her arm, bargaining, meeting with impertinence, defending her miserable money sou by sou. Every month they had to meet some notes, renew others, obtain more time. Her husband worked evenings, making up a tradesman's accounts, and late at night he often copied manuscript for 5 sous a page. This life lasted 10 years. At the end of 10 years they had paid everything, with the rates of usury and the accumulations of the compound interest. Madame Loisel looked old now. She had become the woman of impoverished households, strong and hard and rough. With frowsy hair, skirts askew, and red hands, she talked loud while washing the floors with great swishes of water. But sometimes, when her husband was at the office, she sat down near the window, and she thought of that gay evening of long ago, of that ball where she had been so beautiful and so admired. What would have happened if she had not lost that necklace? Who knows? Who knows? How strange and changeful is life! How small a thing is needed to make or ruin us! But one Sunday, having gone to take a walk in the Champs-Élysées to refresh herself after the labors of the week, she suddenly perceived a woman who was leading a child. It was Madame Forestier, still young, still beautiful, still charming. Madame Loisel felt moved. Should she speak to her? Yes, certainly. And now that she had paid, she should tell her all about it. Why not? She went up. Good day, Jean. The other, astonished to be familiarly addressed by this plain goodwife, did not recognize her at all, and stammered, But, Madame, I do not know. You must have been mistaken. No, I am Mathilde Loisel. Her friend uttered a cry. Oh, my poor Mathilde! How you are changed! Yes, I have had a pretty hard life since I saw you last, and a great poverty, and that because of you. Of me? How so? Do you remember that diamond necklace you lent me to wear at the ministerial ball? Yes. Well? Well, I lost it. What do you mean? You brought it back. I brought you back another exactly like it, and it has taken us 10 years to pay for it. You can understand that it was not easy for us who had nothing, and at last it is ended, and I am very glad. Madame Forestier had stopped. You say that you brought a necklace of diamonds to replace mine? Yes, you never noticed it then. They were very similar. And she smiled with a joy that was at once proud and ingenuous. Madame Forestier, deeply moved, took her hands. Oh, my poor Mathilde! Why, my necklace was paste. It was worth at most only 500 francs. End of The Diamond Necklace.
And as with all good situational irony, you don't get the kick in the teeth until the very last line. It's just such a great story and brutal. But again, de Maupassant builds that situation perfectly so that the last line actually means something. Kind of like at the very end of The Cask of Amontillado. Actually, did any of you read Usher 2? Not quite the last line in Usher 2 also. That's the one from the Martian Chronicles, the one by Ray Bradbury that I can't read because of copyright law. That also has a very good almost last line. So anyway, great story. Thank you, Mr. Maupassant. Now on to the real chick lit. And this is the first time I've ever done anything on Edna Ferber because Ferber, not surprisingly, isn't very often anthologized. And if she was anthologized, this is certainly not the story that would be anthologized. It would raise far too many questions in a high school English class, which is a shame, honestly. One of the things that kept coming to mind while I was listening to this was Gone with the Wind. If you saw Gone with the Wind as a child or as an adult, it actually probably doesn't matter. The character of Belle Watling I found, even as a child, I found fascinating the how awfully she was treated by these people who purported to be, good Christian folk who turned the other cheek and all that. And yet, here's this woman who's trying to donate money to the cause, and the women wouldn't even take her money. Rhett is the only one man enough to take the money from her. I love Rhett Butler. He's that Darcy guy again. It just can't ever go too far away from Darcy, can it? My life revolves around Darcy while my husband's gone. So today's story has a Belle Watling-like character, and I thought it was kind of an interesting piece of writing because it's written from a third-person narrator who's just an observer and never has a name and never has a character, but is constantly providing commentary both on the main character, the woman who tried to be good, and the townspeople. And so you get kind of this lovely, almost journalistic reportage of the whole thing. And it's really quite artfully done. I had to listen to it a couple of times to hear what she was actually doing in her setup. And I thought it was spectacular. So I hope you enjoy Edna Ferber's The Woman Who Tried to Be Good.
The Woman Who Tried to Be Good by Edna Ferber. Before she tried to be a good woman, she had been a very bad woman. So bad that she could trail her wonderful apparel up and down Main Street, from the Elm Tree Bakery to the railroad tracks, without once having a man doff his hat to her or a woman bow. You passed her on the street with a surreptitious glance, though she was well worth looking at in her furs and laces and plumes. She had the only full-length mink coat in our town, and Gans's shoe store sent to Chicago for her shoes. Hers were the miraculously small feet you frequently see in stout women. Usually she walked alone, but on rare occasions, especially round Christmas time, she might have been seen accompanied by some silent, dull-eyed, stupid-looking girl who would follow her dumbly in and out of stores, stopping now and then to admire a cheap comb or a chain set with flashy imitation stones, or queerly enough a doll with yellow hair and blue eyes and very pink cheeks. But alone or in company, her appearance in the stores of our town was the signal of a sudden jump in the cost of living. The storekeepers milked her, and she knew it and paid in silence, for she was one of the class that has no redress. She owned the house with the closed shutters near the freight depot, did Blanche Devine. In a larger town than ours, she would have passed unnoticed. She did not look like a bad woman. Of course she used too much makeup, and as she passed you caught the oversweet breath of a certain heavy scent. Then, too, her diamond eardrops would have made any woman's features look hard. But her plump face, in spite of its heaviness, wore an expression of good-humored intelligence, and her eyeglasses gave her somehow a look of respectability. We do not associate vice with eyeglasses. So in a large city she would have passed for a well-dressed, prosperous, comfortable wife and mother who was in danger of losing her figure from an overabundance of good living. But with us she was a town character, like Old Man Givens the drunkard, or the weak-minded Binns girl. When she passed the drugstore corner, there would be a sniggering among the vacant-eyed loafers idling there, and they would leer at each other and jest in undertones. So, knowing Blanche Devine as we did, there was something resembling a riot in one of our most respectable neighborhoods when it was learned that she had given up her interest in the house near the freight depot and was going to settle down in the white cottage on the corner and be good. All the husbands in the block, urged on by righteously indignant wives, dropped in on Alderman Mooney after supper to see if the thing could not be stopped. The fourth of the protesting husbands to arrive was the very young husband, who lived next door to the corner cottage that Blanche Devine had bought. The very young husband had a very young wife, and they were joint owners of Snooky. Snooky was 3 going on 4, and looked something like an angel, only healthier and with grimier hands.
The whole neighborhood borrowed her and tried to spoil her, but Snooky would not spoil. Alderman Mooney was down in the cellar, fooling with the furnace. He was in his furnace overalls, a short black pipe in his mouth. 3 protesting husbands had just left. As the very young husband, following Mrs. Mooney's directions, descended the cellar stairs, Alderman Mooney looked up from his tinkering. He peered through a haze of pipe smoke. "Hello," he called, and waved the haze away with his open palm. "Come on down. Been tinkering with this blamed furnace since supper. She don't draw like she ought. Long towards spring a furnace always gets balky. How many tons you used this winter?" "Oh, 5," said the very young husband shortly. Alderman Mooney considered it thoughtfully. The young husband leaned up against the side of the water tank, his hands in his pockets. "Say, Mooney, is that right about Blanche Devine's having bought the house on the corner? You're the 4th man that's been in to ask me that this evening. I'm expecting the rest of the block before bedtime. She bought it all right." The young husband flushed and kicked at a piece of coal with the toe of his boot. "Well, it's a darn shame," he began hotly. "Jen was ready to cry at supper. This'll be a fine neighborhood for Snooky to grow up in. What's a woman like that want to come into a respectable street for anyway? I own my home and pay my taxes." Alderman Mooney looked up. "So does she," he interrupted. "She's going to improve the place, paint it, and put in a cellar and a furnace, and build a porch, and lay a cement walk all around." The young husband took his hands out of his pockets in order to emphasize his remarks with gestures. "What's that got to do with it? I don't care if she puts in diamonds for windows and sets out Italian gardens and a terrace with peacocks on it. You're the alderman of this ward, aren't you? Well, it was up to you to keep her out of this block. You could have fixed it with an injunction or something." Alderman Mooney closed the furnace door with a bang that drowned the rest of the threat. He turned the draft in a pipe overhead and brushed his sooty palms briskly together like one who would put an end to a profitless conversation. "She's bought the house," he said mildly, "and paid for it, and it's hers. She's got a right to live in this neighborhood as long as she acts respectable." The very young husband laughed. "She won't last. They never do." Alderman Mooney had taken his pipe out of his mouth and was rubbing his thumb over the smooth bowl, looking down at it with unseeing eyes. On his face was a queer look, the look of one who was embarrassed because he is about to say something honest. "Look here, I want to tell you something. I happened to be up in the mayor's office the day Blanche signed for the place. She had to go through a lot of red tape before she got it. Had quite a time of it, she did. And say, kid, that woman ain't so bad." The very young husband exclaimed impatiently, "Oh, don't give me any of that, Mooney. Blanche Devine's a town character. Even the kids know what she is. If she's got religion or something and wants to quit and be decent, why doesn't she go to another town, Chicago or someplace, where nobody knows her?" That motion of Alderman Mooney's thumb against the smooth pipe bowl stopped. He looked up slowly. "That's what I said. The mayor, too. But Blanche Devine said she wanted to try it here. She said this was her home. Funny, ain't it? Said she wouldn't be fooling anybody here. They know her. And if she moved away, she said, it'd leak out some way, sooner or later. It does, she said, always. Seems she wants to live like, well, like other women. She put it like this. She says she hasn't got religion or any of that. She says she's no different than she was when she was 20. She says for the last 10 years, the ambition of her life has been to be able to go into a grocery store and ask for the price of, say, celery. And if the clerk charged her 10 when it ought to be 7, to be able to sass him with a regular piece of her mind. and then sail out and trade somewhere else until he saw that she didn't have to stand anything from storekeepers, any more than any other woman that did her own marketing. She's a smart woman, Blanche is. God knows I ain't taken her part exactly, but she talked a little, and the mayor and me got a little of her history." A sneer appeared on the face of the very young husband. He had been known, before he met Jen, as a rather industrious sower of wild oats. He knew a thing or two, did the very young husband, in spite of his youth. He always fussed when Jen wore even a V-necked summer gown on the street. "Oh, she wasn't playing for sympathy," went on Alderman Mooney in answer to the sneer. "She said she'd always pay her way and always expected to. Seems her husband left her without a cent when she was 18, with a baby. She worked for $4 a week in a cheap eating house. The two of them couldn't live on that. And then the baby—" "Good night," said the very young husband. "I suppose Mrs. Mooney's going to call?" "Minnie, it was her scolding all through supper that drove me down to monkey with the furnace. She's wild, Minnie is." He peeled off his overalls and hung them on a nail. The young husband started to ascend the cellar stairs. Alderman Mooney laid a detaining finger on his sleeve. "Don't say anything in front of Minnie. She's boiling. Minnie and the kids are going to visit her folks out west this summer, so I won't so much as dare say good morning to the divine woman. Anyway, a person wouldn't talk to her, I suppose, but I kind of thought I'd tell you about her." "Thanks," said the very young husband dryly. In the early spring, before Blanche Devine moved in, there came stonemasons who began to build something. It was a great stone fireplace that rose in massive incongruity at the side of the little white cottage. Blanche Devine was trying to make a home for herself. Blanche Devine used to come and watch them now and then as the work progressed. She had a way of walking round and round the house, looking up at it and poking at plaster and paint with her umbrella or fingertip. One day she brought with her a man with a spade. He spaded up a neat square of ground at the side of the cottage and a long ridge near the fence that separated her yard from the very young couple next door. The ridge spelled sweet peas and nasturtiums to our small-town eyes. On the day that Blanche Devine moved in, there was wild agitation among the white-ruffled bedroom curtains of the neighborhood. Later on, certain odors, as of burning dinners, pervaded the atmosphere. Blanche Devine, flushed and excited, her hair slightly askew, her diamond eardrops flashing, directed the moving, wrapped in her great fur coat, but on the third morning we gasped when she appeared out of doors carrying a little household ladder, a pail of steaming water, and sundry voluminous white cloths. She reared the little ladder against the side of the house, mounted it cautiously, and began to wash windows with housewifely thoroughness. Her stout figure was swathed in a gray sweater, and on her head was a battered felt hat, the sort of window-washing costume that has been worn by women from time immemorial. We noticed that she used plenty of hot water and clean rags, and that she rubbed the glass until it sparkled, leaning perilously sideways on the ladder to detect elusive streaks. Our keenest housekeeping eye could find no fault with the way Blanche Devine washed windows. By May, Blanche Devine had left off her diamond eardrops. Perhaps it was their absence that gave her face a new expression. When she went downtown, we noticed that her hats were more like the hats the other woman in our town wore, but she still affected extravagant footgear, as is right and proper for a stout woman who has cause to be vain of her feet. We noticed that her trips downtown were rare that spring and summer. She used to come home laden with little bundles, and before supper she would change her street clothes for a neat washable house dress, as is our thrifty custom. Through her bright windows we could see her moving briskly about from kitchen to sitting room, and from the smells that floated out from her kitchen door, she seemed to be preparing for her solitary supper the same homely viands that were frying or stewing or baking in our kitchens. Sometimes you could detect the delectable scent of browning hot tea biscuit. It takes a determined woman to make a tea biscuit for no one but herself. Blanche Devine joined the church. On the first Sunday morning she came to the service, there was a little flurry among the ushers at the vestibule door. They seated her well in the rear. The second Sunday morning a dreadful thing happened. The woman next to whom they seated her turned, regarded her stonily for a moment, then rose agitatedly and moved to a pew across the aisle. Blanche Devine's face went a dull red beneath her white powder. She never came again, though we saw the minister visit her once or twice. She always accompanied him to the door pleasantly, holding it well open until he was down the little flight of steps and on the sidewalk. The minister's wife did not call. She rose early, like the rest of us, and as summer came on, we used to see her moving about in her little garden patch in the dewy golden morning. She wore absurd pale blue negligees that made her stout figure loom immense against the greenery of the garden and apple tree. The neighborhood women viewed these negligees with Puritan disapproval as they smoothed down their own prim, starched gingham skirts. They said it was disgusting, and perhaps it was, but the habit of years is not easily overcome. Blanche Devine, snipping her sweet peas, peering anxiously at the Virginia creeper that clung with such fragile fingers to the trellis, watering the flower baskets that hung from her porch, was blissfully unconscious of the disapproving eyes. I wish one of us had just stopped to call good morning to her over the fence, and to say in our neighborly small-town way, "My, ain't this a scorcher? So early, too. It'll be fierce by noon." But we did not. I think perhaps the evenings must have been the loneliest for her. The summer evenings in our little town are filled with intimate, human, neighborly sounds. After the heat of the day, it is pleasant to relax in the cool comfort of the front porch with the life of the town eddying about us. We sew and read out there until it grows dusk. We call across lots to our next-door neighbor. The men water the lawns and the flower boxes and get together in little, quiet groups to discuss the new street paving. I have even known Mrs. Hines to bring her cherries out there when she had a canning to do, and pit them there on the front porch, partially shielded by her porch vine, but not so effectually that she was deprived of the sights and sounds about her. The kettle in her lap, and the dishpan full of great ripe cherries on the porch floor by her chair, she would pit and chat and peer out through the vines, the red juice staining her plump bare arms. I have wondered since what Blanche Devine thought of us those lonesome evenings, those evenings filled with friendly sights and sounds. It must have been difficult for her, who had dwelt behind closed shutters for so long, to seat herself on the new front porch for all the world to stare at. But she did sit there, resolutely, watching us in silence. She seized hungrily upon the stray crumbs of conversation that fell to her. The milkman and the iceman and the butcher boy used to hold daily conversations with her. They, sociable gentlemen, would stand on her doorstep, one grimy hand resting against the white of her doorpost, exchanging the time of day with Blanche in the doorway, a tea-towel in one hand, perhaps, and a plate in the other. Her little house was a miracle of cleanliness. It was no uncommon sight to see her down on her knees on the kitchen floor, wielding her brush and rag like the rest of us. In canning and preserving time, there floated out from her kitchen the pungent scent of pickled crab apples, the mouth-watering smell that meant sweet pickles, or the cloying, divinely sticky odor that meant raspberry jam. Snooky, from her side of the fence, often used to peer through the pickets, gazing in the direction of the enticing smells next door. Early one September morning, there floated out from Blanche Devine's kitchen that fragrant, sweet scent of fresh-baked cookies, cookies with butter in them and spice and with nuts on top. Just by the smell of them, your mind's eye pictured them coming from the oven, crisp, brown circlets, crumbly, delectable. Snooky, in her scarlet sweater and cap, sniffed them from afar and straightway deserted her sandpile to take her stand at the fence. She peered through the restraining bars, standing on tiptoe. Blanche Devine, glancing up from her board and rolling pin, saw the eager golden head, and Snooky, with guile in her heart, raised one fat, dimpled hand above the fence and waved it friendlily. Blanche Devine waved back. Thus encouraged, Snooky's 2 hands wig-wagged frantically above the pickets. Blanche Devine hesitated a moment, her flowery hand on her hip. Then she went to the pantry shelf and took out a clean white saucer. She selected from the brown jar on the table 3 of the brownest, crumbliest, most perfect cookies, with a walnut meat perched atop of each, placed them temptingly on the saucer, and, descending the steps, came swiftly across the grass to the triumphant Snooky. Blanche Devine held out the saucer, her lips smiling, her eyes tender. Snooky reached up with one plump white arm. "Snooky!" shrilled a high voice. "Snooky!" a voice of horror and of wrath. "Come here to me this minute, and don't you dare to touch those!" Snooky hesitated rebelliously, one pink finger in her pouting mouth. "Snooky, do you hear me?" And the very young housewife began to descend the steps of her back porch. Snooky, regretful eyes on the toothsome dainties, turned away aggrieved. The very young housewife, her lips set, her eyes flashing, advanced and seized the shrieking Snooky by one arm and dragged her away towards home and safety. Blanche Devine stood there at the fence, holding the saucer in her hand. The saucer tipped slowly, and the 3 cookies slipped off and fell to the grass. Blanche Devine stood, staring at them a moment. Then she turned quickly, went into the house, and shut the door. It was about this time we noticed that Blanche Devine was away much of the time. The little white cottage would be empty for weeks. We knew she was out of town because the expressman would come for her trunk. We used to lift our eyebrows significantly. The newspapers and handbills would accumulate in a dusty little heap on the porch. But when she returned, there was always a grand cleaning, with the windows open, and Blanche, her head bound turban-wise in a towel, appearing at a window every few minutes to shake out a dust cloth. She seemed to put an enormous amount of energy into those cleanings, as if they were a sort of safety valve. As winter came on, she used to sit up before her grate fire, long after we were asleep in our beds. When she neglected to pull down the shades, we could see the flames of her cozy fire dancing gnome-like on the wall. There came a night of sleet and snow and wind and rattling hail, one of those blustering wild nights that are followed by morning paper reports of trains stalled in snowdrifts, mail delayed, telephone and telegraph wires down. It must have been midnight or past when there came a hammering at Blanche Devine's door, a persistent, clamorous rapping. Blanche Devine, sitting before her dying fire, half asleep, started and cringed when she heard it, then jumped to her feet, her hand at her breast, her eyes darting this way and that, as though seeking escape. She had heard a rapping like that before. It had meant bluecoats swarming up the stairway, and frightened cries and pleadings and wild confusion. So she started forward now, quivering, and then she remembered, being wholly awake now, she remembered, and threw up her head and smiled a little bitterly and walked toward the door. The hammering continued, louder than ever. Blanche Devine flicked on the porch light and opened the door. The half-clad figure of the very young wife next door staggered into the room. She seized Blanche Devine's arm with both her frenzied hands and shook her, the wind and snow beating in upon both of them. "The baby!" she screamed in a high, hysterical voice. The baby! The baby!" Blanche Devine shut the door and shook the young wife smartly by the shoulders. "Stop screaming," she said quietly. "Is she sick?" The young wife told her, her teeth chattering. "Come quick! She's dying! Will's out of town. I tried to get the doctor. The telephone wouldn't. I saw your light. For God's sake!" Blanche Devine grasped the young wife's arm, opened the door, and together they sped across the little space that separated the two houses. Blanche Devine was a big woman, but she took the stairs like a girl and found the right bedroom by some miraculous woman instinct. A dreadful, choking, rattling sound was coming from Snooky's bed. "Croup," said Blanche Devine, and began her fight. It was a good fight. She marshaled her inadequate forces, made up of the half-fainting young wife and the terrified and awkward hired girl. "Get the hot water on. Lots of it." Blanche Devine pinned up her sleeves. "Hot cloths. Tear up a sheet or anything. Got an oil stove? I want a tea kettle boiling in the room. She's got to have the steam. If that don't do it, we'll raise an umbrella over her and throw a sheet over and hold the kettle under till the steam gets to her that way. Got any ipecac?" The young wife obeyed orders, white-faced and shaking. Once, Blanche Devine glanced up at her sharply. "Don't you dare faint," she commanded. And the fight went on. Gradually, the breathing that had been so frightful became softer, easier. Blanche Devine did not relax. It was not until the little figure breathed gently in sleep that Blanche Devine sat back, satisfied. Then she tucked a cover at the side of the bed, took a last satisfied look at the face on the pillow, and turned to look at the wan, disheveled young wife. "She's all right now. We can get the doctor when morning comes, though I don't know's you'll need him." The young wife came round to Blanche Devine's side of the bed and stood looking up at her. "My baby died," said Blanche Devine simply. The young wife gave a little inarticulate cry, put her two hands on Blanche Devine's broad shoulders, and laid her tired head on her breast. "I guess I'd better be going," said Blanche Devine. The young wife raised her head. Her eyes were round with fright. "Going? Oh, please stay. I'm so afraid. Suppose she should take sick again. That awful breathing." "I'll stay if you want me to." "Oh, please. I'll make up your bed and you can rest. I'm not sleepy. I'm not much of a hand to sleep anyway. I'll sit up here in the hall where there's a light. You go to bed. I'll watch and see that everything's all right. Have you got something I can read out here? Something kind of lively, with a love story in it?" So the night went by. Snooky slept in her white bed. The very young wife half dozed on her bed, so near the little one. In the hall, her stout figure looming grotesque in the wall shadows, sat Blanche Devine, pretending to read. Now and then she rose and tiptoed into the bedroom with miraculous quiet, and stooped over the little bed and listened and looked, and tiptoed away again, satisfied. The young husband came home from his business trip next day with tales of snowdrifts and stalled engines. Blanche Devine breathed a sigh of relief when she saw him from her kitchen window. She watched the house now with a sort of proprietary eye. She wondered about Snooky, but she knew better than to ask. So she waited. The young wife next door had told her husband all about that awful night, had told him with tears and sobs. The very young husband had been very, very angry with her. Angry, he said, and astonished. Snooky could not have been so sick. Look at her now, as well as ever. And to have called such a woman! Well, he did not want to be harsh, but she must understand that she must never speak to that woman again. Never. So the next day, the very young wife happened to go by with the young husband. Blanche Devine spied them from her sitting-room window, and she made the excuse of looking in her mailbox in order to go to the door. She stood in the doorway, and the very young wife went by on the arm of her husband. She went by, rather white-faced, without a look or a word or a sign. And then this happened. There came into Blanche Devine's face a look that made slits of her eyes and drew her mouth down into an ugly, narrow line, and that made the muscles of her jaw tense and hard. It was the ugliest look you can imagine. Then she smiled, if having one's lips curl away from one's teeth can be called smiling. 2 days later, there was great news of the white cottage on the corner. The curtains were down, the furniture was packed, the rugs were rolled. The wagons came and backed up to the house and took those things that had made a home for Blanche Devine. And when we heard that she had bought back her interest in the house with the closed shutters near the freight depot, we sniffed. I knew she wouldn't last, we said. They never do, said we. End of The Woman Who Tried to Be Good.
Thank you for spending another hour with me. I hope you enjoyed the stories today. I also wanted to remind you to feel free to send pictures of completed projects, things that you've completed while listening to CraftLit. We have a little gallery going, and I'll keep putting, actually I need to put a link on the template that's over on the right-hand side. Maybe I'll get to that when my husband leaves. I'm going to be a little busy for the next couple of days. But it's been great having you listen. It's great to get the emails from you, and I hope you join me next week for another few short stories. Today, I would like to thank the reader of The Diamond Necklace, but I can't because she never gave her name. And I'd like to thank Eva Marie, who read The Woman Who Tried to Be Good. As always, Joshua Christian provides our opening music, Chasing Hero, from GarageBand.com. You can find a blog for this podcast at craftlit.blogspot.com or craftlit.libsyn.com. That's Craftlit, CraftLit, all one word, and Libsyn, Libsyn. And of course, you can subscribe at iTunes. And do remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.